Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to give you the main guidelines to help you write your methodology. And I'll be following this similar template that you were taught when you wrote up your mini project earlier this term. So the first things you're going to want to open up are the main guidelines document, which you will find up here, and how to write your project. And in that, you're going to find the main piece of information about how to write a methodology, and I'll show you that in a second. Another thing that you're going to want to look at is a number of sample projects that you'll find down below. And when you open up one of these sample projects, have a look at the methodologies to see how the different students approached writing. There isn't a one shoe fits all when it comes to writing up a methodology, because it's likely you're all doing very different styles of projects. And whilst a physical project that might be conducted on a transect, for example, up a hillside, might be very different from an or more urban-based project that might have involved lots of surveys at multiple locations. So the way you lay out your methodology is going to likely look different, and it's worthwhile taking a look at the different examples done by students in previous years to see how they approach their methods. Okay, final thing you're going to want to make sure you've opened up is the actual guidelines document on writing a methodology. Okay, all the work you complete should be done in this document here, which will then be returned to you with feedback and some kind of indication on the level that is achieved with advice on what to do to improve it. Okay, so let's get started. Let's actually have a look at what is the main criteria for methodology. So what I'm showing you right now is the actual student guidelines for how to write a project. And if you scroll down to this page here, that you will find methodology titled with some additional guidelines. So if we have a little look at that, I'm just going to show you the page actually that we're on, so you know which page to scroll down to. So it's on page 15. Now, a methodology, first thing you have to be aware is you are targeting 10 marks. Okay, so that is the maximum amount of marks available to you if you write a really good methodology. And I'll have a look at the actual what 8 to 10 marks looks like and explain that. I'll give you the markers instructions. But basically, if I was to summarize it, your methodology should be telling me how you went about gathering the information, planning, and then gathering the information to answer 3 research questions, which you will have already outlined earlier on. So you'll have already established your 3 research questions, and you will have done that prior to even writing about your background research. You are going to want to show through your method that you were able to gather extensive information that might not have just been gathered by practically going to a location and gathering it, but actually it might have involved secondary data from the internet. And where you've gathered some of your data from the internet and it's not been primary data, it's secondary data, you must be telling me about those websites and how that was gathered as well. All data must be talked about in your methodology, whether it's your own primary data or whether it's secondary data that you're using. You're going to want to explore in as much detail as possibly the sampling techniques that you used. Now, that is, for example, if you were sampling 20 soils or whether it was surveying 30 people, what was the actual sampling technique? And broadly speaking, that would be stratified or systematic or random or some kind of combination, because you might have used more than one sampling technique and different sampling techniques in different situations. You're also going to want to talk about your locations. Now, that might not be appropriate for all studies, but many of you will have been point sampling. You'll have gone to specific locations and gathered samples. So I want to know the distribution of those sample points and how many sampling points you used. And finally, you are going to want to talk about the techniques you use to gather data, and more importantly, why they were appropriate. So you can see here, unlike higher geography, where it's telling me about the technique, at advanced higher, it's justifying the choice of the technique and why that was a suitable technique, which allowed you to study a research question, okay, which you can see there. So what does the mark scheme say? Right, so for 8 to 10 marks, you are going to want to be very clear and explicit that you have planned your project, and I'll show you how to go about doing that. There's lots of different ways that you can show that planning has occurred and that you thought about things prior to going out and gathering your data. You are going to want to be showing me that you've used a range of sources to get your data. So rather than just surveys of 100 people, that you've actually used multiple techniques. And you're going to want to tell me why that particular source, whether it was an interview with a person or drilling a soil sample somewhere, why that was relevant for answering a particular research question you're studying. And finally, you're going to want to skillfully use these research techniques to identify relationships. So you've got to tell me in as much detail as is possible when you're telling me how you gathered your data. Why was it appropriate a technique to use? And how does that mean that it's possible to therefore analyze your results better? So if you can achieve that, and that's quite a high bar to set, you would be achieving between 8 to 10. Now that's the theory. Now this is the point of the tutorial where I would suggest at various points you stop as I go through this and start developing up your methodology. And I've got another document called Writing a Methodology Guidelines. Now this will be familiar to you from your mini project, and you might choose to write up your methodology using the following structure. And if you don't use a very structured approach like I'm outlining here, or if you find it's not appropriate for your particular study, then at least you should have the flavor of these ideas within your method. Okay, so let's start with the plan. Okay, the plan should have multiple things in it. You might even use this as a heading. You're going to first of all be probably showing me a map or a series of maps that identify your actual study location or locations if you are studying multiple locations. And more importantly, you're going to possibly either want to write a detailed explanation or annotate your map or maps in a way that tells me why was the location or location suitable. Okay, now this is not talking about your sampling techniques. This is just telling me, if I just studied in Crieff, why was Crieff suitable? Okay, if I studied a hilltop near in somewhere in the Highlands, why was that suitable locations? And the explanation must be beyond just it's near where I live. Okay, you've got to go a little bit deeper. You've got to think about as many reasons as you can that explain to me why is your location suitable. Okay, now that can be as an annotation on a map, or it can be beneath the map or maps that you've got where you write about it. Next step is to explain to me the actual time in which you will conduct your study. Now, I'd like you to write this as a future tense, as if you haven't yet done it. So you would be saying, I plan to conduct this study, and tell me when. And then why. Why is the time, the date, the particular time of day, maybe across a couple of days or a week-long period. Let's say you did it during the October holidays. Why is that appropriate? Okay. And suitable. If you're going to spend 2 days of data gathering, 8 hours a day, why is that time required to get the data? A lot of it's to do with ensuring that you're free, that you can return to locations, that you can gather suitable sample sizes, that if I would be telling me about backup days that you have to use, and so on and so forth. Okay. Next thing is I now want an outline of the data you intend to gather, and just a very brief description that I will be using this technique, and this technique. Don't explain them yet. That you'll do that further on in your method. Now, if you have conducted a pilot study, I would suggest you also include it in your plan. So a pilot study is a small scale study that you do in advance. It might be just drilling one soil core in your back garden. It might be passing out your survey to 3 people just to see if the questions are all appropriate. And I would suggest, even if you didn't do a pilot study, that you tell me that you did, and that you plan to do a pilot study. Tell me where and how you intend to conduct that pilot study, and explain to me why it's going to be done. Obviously, pilot studies are there to see if there's any flaws in your technique, which allows you to therefore maybe if it's a survey, for example, change a question slightly, in ensuring that when you do the real study, you're getting better quality data, more accurate data, and whatever it is that's relevant in the context of your study. Okay, so that to me is what we call the plan. The next bit, the sampling. Now, The first thing is, if your study involves multiple sample locations, then I suggest you have a map that shows me those multiple sample locations, whether they are 5 areas, different areas that are being studied, whether they are 10 sites on a transect, whether they are 5 places you did studies, whether they are systematic surveys of a high street or multiple high streets. Whatever it is, if it's 2 settlements, but you're going to go into them and then study 10 streets in those settlements, you need to show me a map of the places you are going to gather data. You need to then annotate that map or explain underneath the map why the sample locations that you are visiting were chosen. So why is your sampling strategy relevant? Now, your sampling strategy is going to either be random, systematic, or stratified, or a combination like stratified systematic. You've got to justify your technique. That is incredibly important. I know exactly why you did the technique you did. Why does it improve the data quality, or why is it the only solution? To be honest, any sampling strategy is possible, but you will have done one. You might not have thought about why you did it that way, but now I need to know that actually you've thought about it and that it's suitable because. Now you can use your advanced higher geographical methods and techniques student booklet to look at why different sampling strategies are suitable and appropriate. Or you can go online and Google it, why would I use a systematic sampling or a stratified sampling strategy, and then apply it to your own study. Okay. Second thing about sampling is you then got to think about the sample size. So you might have taken 3 soil core samples at a location. You might have interviewed 30 people at that location, and half of them might have been women, half of them might have been men. So why did you choose the sample size? Why was it suitable? Why was it appropriate? It might be because it allows you to conduct statistical tests and therefore it had to be of a certain size, or because you wanted to ensure that you had a large enough sample in case, especially with surveys, by the way, if you do a very small sample with surveys, 1 or 2 people's attitudes are going to be overrepresented in a small sample. Likewise, if you only gather 5 soil samples, if one of those soil samples is very different from all the others, it's going to skew your data. It's going to misrepresent your data. So obviously, the larger the sample size, the better. But you've got to tell me why. And as with all things, the more reasons you can give me for justifying the sample size that you've chosen and the strategy you've chosen, the better. Okay, so have a little read through this. Just check that you have done everything that I've outlined here in terms of sampling strategies. Okay, write it up in the context of your own project. Use maps where appropriate to illustrate this, if it's appropriate to your study. And then you're ready for the final phase of the methodology, which is actually how did I gather my data? Okay, now, some students get overly obsessed in this bit, telling me in minutiae about exactly how they drilled the soil core sample and how they extracted the soil auger and took a sample from the middle of the soil of the auger itself and put it in a bag and numbered the bag and then went and got an oven and baked it at 105 degrees to burn off the moisture, which allowed them to calculate the percentage moisture content of that soil. Now that is all descriptive technique, and you must do this. I need to know exactly the method used, whether it's for a soil sample or whether it's a survey or whether it's an environmental quality study, whatever it is. But I suggest you minimize that and actually focus more on the second bullet point here, which is justifying why you did it that way. So let's have a look at this first bullet point, though. How can I describe everything I've done to gather my data, the physical techniques I used? And by the way, these might not be primary techniques where you've actually gone into the field and conducted your data gathering. This might be involving going on a website and extracting the relevant data from that website. Why did you use that website? Why did you choose the data that you got from that website? Should you trust that data from that website? It might, in some of your projects, that might be appropriate. But actually, I think if you've got some photographs of you gathering the data, whether it's doing an interview on a high street with somebody, maybe you've got your parent or a brother to photograph you conducting a survey, or there's a photograph of you on a hillside or in a river or in a forest, actually practically gathering the data. What's great is you can then annotate that photograph with what the photo's showing. You can tell me the story of how you gathered the data, but it's attached to an image. First of all, that saves your word count substantially. Second of all, a photograph of you gathering data, whether it's a staged photo that you've just gone out and done yourself, just to represent you gathering the data, it makes me engage with your text much better if I can see a photograph and see, oh, right, okay, that's how they got the gradient of the slope. That's how they got the soil sample. That's how they conducted a survey with a clipboard on a high street. And then I can just read around that photo with your annotations. And remember, an annotation is not just a description, it's an explanation of what the photo is showing. The main body of the text for how did I gather the data should be, I did it this way because. And it's always about, why is this technique the best technique? Now, it might not be the best technique, but it might be the only one that's possible to you using the equipment and technology that you've got. Okay. So for example, you might be telling me that you have done a survey on a high street with members of the public, but you could only do 20 people and you could only ask 5 questions because you couldn't be in contact with them for more than 5 minutes due to COVID-19 restrictions. And therefore you had to curtail your sampling strategy. You might be telling me that you had to put envelopes through people's doors and collect them later because of COVID-19 protocols, assuming you're listening to this video during the pandemic. If you're not, there might be other reasons why you've done it the way you've done it. Because you only had a certain amount of time. If it's a river study, it might be raining and therefore you have to get all of your data in one day before it rains. Or if it's on a hillside, you've got to get all your data before it gets dark. So it might be simple reasons like that. That's why you did it. But more often than not, the justification comes from ensuring you've done something in a certain way to improve the accuracy and quality of the data you've gathered. And I need you to be explicit about saying, I did this technique was done this way because it, and it should relate to improving the accuracy, improving the quality, or improving the amount of data that you can gather. So doing something quick is not a bad thing. I mean, if you do something that takes you 2 minutes, you might say, oh, well, that could compromise the quality. The advantage of spending 2 minutes to do something is you can then do it lots, so you can get a big data survey. And if you're sending samples out online, obviously the quality of surveys will be poorer because you're not doing face-to-face. However, you can hit a much bigger sample if you send it out to friends. So there's your justifying. Okay. Your last 2 things relate to sampling, okay, and conducting surveys. And I've just said, if you're doing that, explain how it was being done and why it's being done that way. Now, I can tell you now that almost in all of these bits, both the plan, the sampling strategies, and the data gathering, the justifications and the whys, the explanations for why you did things the way you did them, is where the bulk of the marks come from. And now that I'm getting near to the end of this tutorial, and you may have paused me at various points and written it yourself, or you might be listening through the first time and then coming at this in a lot more detail. Let's just have a look, go back to the actual student guidelines that you should be following. Okay, at the start of this tutorial, I said you should look at other students and what they've written. And that's a really top recommendation. It does show you how other students have approached this, even students that have done very different projects to yourself. Okay, the second thing, and I'm just going to scroll down to page 14 to show you the methodology, is that you need to be explicit. Now, the methodology says that. Let me just scroll down. It's just taking a bit of time to load up. So you're looking here at planning and carrying out detailed research, which could include fieldwork. Hopefully your project does include fieldwork. Now, fieldwork can be desk-based research, as well as being going out to the physical field, going outside and gathering your data. Whether if you've done one or both or a combination of primary and secondary, it all needs talked about. Everything is method. And finally, if I just can scroll down to page 14, where we've got the method. Last piece of information, just let it scroll down. It's taking a long time to load up. Is in those guidelines, it does quite clearly say you are targeting to be explicit. Now, explicit means where you directly relate to what you were doing in your actual data gathering, rather than talking about in theory. When you talk about I used stratified sampling, don't tell me about how great stratified sampling is. Well, do tell me, please tell me that, but relate it to actually how you did stratified sampling. Okay. And finally, this is taking a long time to load up, and I do apologize. The last part of this is how long should this be? Now, this is the difficult bit because methodologies tend to get overwritten dramatically and they end up being well over 1,000 words. You are looking to have a method that is no longer than 800 words. However, annotations do not count in word limits. That's the nice side. That's the upside of this. The body of the text, which would be like this here, where you're writing about it, that's what counts as towards your 800 words. Okay, so here we are. Finally, it's loaded up. We've got the methodology, plan and carry out detailed research, and be explicit. So we've got the final bit just loading up here, and I'm just going to finish this tutorial on that. I'm sorry, it's jumping around. So I'm just going to cut the tutorial off here and just tell you, go back to this how to write project, look at the marking guidelines on page 14 and target those marks. Okay, that's the end of the tutorial.